Hello everyone. Thank you for coming to our workshop this afternoon. Catherine and I will just introduce ourselves and just like really briefly, I guess, set the scene, and then we'll go to a screen share sort of thing with our PowerPoint. And this workshop, we'll kind of do, I don't know, 2/3 of it maybe in terms of presentation about our REDS project that Wendy's talked a bit about and we'll talk more about in a moment. And then for the last third, we'll kind of throw it open to discussions and stuff. And we've got Jerry here who will kind of be keeping an eye on the chat and bringing together any themes and that sort of jazz. Thank you very much. So hello, I am Matt. I am an advisory teacher with a social, emotional, mental health team here in Devon. There's a little group of us, maybe about a dozen these days, maybe a couple less than that, who have a role in supporting schools to support children at risk of exclusion. And I have a particular role. I am fortunate enough to work alongside Catherine and to an extent also as part of work with the virtual school. And you obviously all met Wendy earlier on in terms of developing practice and procedures and policy sort of stuff linked to children in care.
I'm Catherine Dunnett. I'm an educational psychologist. I've got some specialist time to work with the virtual school team on their projects to do with including our most vulnerable children. And our big piece of work at the moment is thinking about how we support schools to use relational and restorative approaches to make sure that all children are fully included in school, but really with a really sort of specific focus on trying to reduce exclusion from school, and particularly our most vulnerable children who may have experienced trauma or developmental trauma or ACEs. So really trying to keep those children included in school.
So today, Catherine and I are going to talk you through an approach to reducing exclusions and supporting schools to have an understanding of the needs of particular children in their school, and to think about how they might go about meeting those needs. And so the approach is called Reducing Exclusions in Devon Schools, and it is referred to as REDS. So the REDS process is about bringing together a group of people who shouldn't really feel disparate, but a group of people who can feel disparate in terms of joined up working. So it brings together social care, it brings together education staff, it brings together foster carers, it brings together people from the virtual school team, etc., and professionals such as the educational psychologist and advisor to really work together for a kind of shared purpose and to develop some understanding and some empathy in terms of really understanding the needs of a child in care, and then over time thinking about how we might meet those needs together. And just one thing to say on that, for lots of us, in fact probably everyone that's on this kind of conference day today, the idea of having empathy for these children is like, well, of course we do, you know. The idea of having an understanding of their underlying needs is kind of really obvious for all of us, but it's really worth saying, with in no way meaning to patronize staff in schools, is that for a great number of adults working in school, although they're lovely people and empathic and want the best for children, there is not a common understanding of the kind of consequences or the outcomes of children that have had trauma and adversity. And often there are also school systems that simply reinforce challenging behaviour with more behaviourism, which ends up being really unhelpful.
So we're particularly concerned about exclusion with our most vulnerable children. I think that there has been such a push in schools on looking after children in care that the figures for permanent exclusion with regards to the children in care is going down. But we need to be a bit wary about those statistics, because what we are aware of is that sometimes those children might not be permanently excluded, but they are still leaving the school because they may have been sent to an alternative provision and then specialist provision, or forgot what I was going to say. So,
certain systems within the school might exasperate some of their.
Yeah, absolutely, or manage moves or things like that. So whilst the headline figure for permanent exclusion might look okay, actually what we know is that our children in care are leaving schools at quite a high rate. In terms of children in need are twice as likely to be permanently excluded than other children. Looked after children are more than 5 times more likely to have a fixed period of exclusion. And when we go on to talk about that, we'll see why that is really detrimental. And this final figure is really interesting. So children who are eligible for free school meals are around 4 times more likely to be excluded permanently or a fixed period exclusion than children who are not eligible for free school meals. So we're picking up these real patterns of vulnerability for exclusion amongst our most disadvantaged children. And what we know is that there are lots of negative consequences related to permanent exclusion. So the vast majority of children who are permanently excluded never go back into a mainstream school. Lots of them never go to a school where they have their needs met. They tend to stay in PRUs, which are not really designed for long-term stay children. The children who've been permanently excluded are far more likely to go on to be NEET, far more likely to head into the sort of criminal justice system. And there's a really strong link between permanent exclusion and mental health issues. So students who've been permanently excluded from school are far more likely to suffer real emotional distress, which can go on well into life and manifest itself in terms of mental health difficulties. So it feels really important to keep children in school and to make it really clear and to schools that permanent exclusion doesn't mean that then that child will then miraculously have their needs met. So sometimes we hear people in school to say, well, we'll have to permanently exclude them. We can't meet their needs, but if we permanently exclude them, then they'll have their needs met elsewhere. And what we know is that that doesn't tend to happen. And whilst we'd all like that to happen, the reality is that for those students, they're far more likely to have their needs met within their mainstream school. You know, that's what they need. They need people to stick with them, not reject them, not abandon them. They don't need any more change in their life. They need consistency and strong relationships that they're able to form and mend when they get things wrong.
I think that's really interesting as well, Catherine, that the point you make there, that particularly if we were to think about children in care, long-term relationships are far more significant for them and far more important for them to experience than fresh starts. The comfortable narrative of a fresh start will be good. And we understand why people in schools, they're not like trying to trick themselves, but we understand why a fresh start might make us feel better about the situation we're in. But actually, not only is it detrimental to those children in terms of relationships, but also what ultimately we want children in care to understand is that repair is possible. Things go wrong doesn't mean endings. Things going wrong means an opportunity to try and repair. And actually, relationships aren't always supposed to be like they only exist when I'm doing good. Yeah. Repair is a feature of relationships. And so some of the REDS process is about supporting an understanding of some, I guess, uncomfortable truths for people in schools.
And this piece of research is very interesting as well, because fixed term exclusions or internal exclusion and sending students to isolation or reset is often used in school as a deterrent. So with a belief, a warning and then a fixed term exclusion will lead to that child being able to change their behaviour. But what this research said very, very, very clearly is that that isn't the case. It doesn't act as a deterrent. And the more fixed term exclusions that a child has, the more likely they are to become disengaged from school. And it has really negative effects in terms of their mental health, absenteeism from school, and also additional strain on carers who need to look after them in the home. So the use of fixed term exclusion and internal exclusion as an intervention also is really detrimental to the child.
Okay, so the idea behind REDS is that we get that group of people who have different perspectives and different expertise together, working under a kind of joined up common ground. The idea is that that group of people, from the social worker to the foster carer to the mentor in school to the child's tutor, etc., coming together to develop a shared understanding through the sharing of their expertise. And we'll see in a moment how the child's voice comes into this really clearly as well. But this is about getting a group of, sometimes it can feel disparate people all working really hard in their unique way in their little silos or bubbles. But this is about joining them up for a shared kind of purpose and experience.
The only comment so far that you won't see is about excluding a child being like putting them on the naughty step, and that actually children need help with their feelings rather than being put on their own. So thanks for that, Pamela. It sort of sums it up nicely, actually.
Yes, thank you, Pamela. It's a really good point. And I think that there's an understandable idea that the rewards and sanctions will be enough to help children, you know, a deterrent, and will reward the good stuff. But all of the evidence is telling us that for children who cannot regulate themselves, who do not feel secure in relationships, who have not had experiences that enable them to trust adults, understand how all of that works, etc., etc., if you do not have an ability to regulate yourself and an awareness of yourself, those punishments, and I know that you know this, Pamela, but will just reinforce a sense of disconnect, rejection, loss, shame, etc. And I think that we all know this, and I think the evidence is clear on this. I think what's surprising and disappointing, but also just real, is that that message doesn't seem to be clear in schools, or people like us have not done a good enough job of kind of explaining that in schools. And interestingly, the approach around REDS, the slide that hopefully you can see in front of you, seeks to support people to understand that sort of stuff.
So the virtual school team commissioned the Educational Psychology Service and the SEMH Advisory Teacher Service to facilitate this REDS process. So referrals are made to the EdPsych team through the learning advocates who are part of the virtual school team. And schools, after referral is made, need to commit to organising a series of 3 meetings, which is quite time consuming, and getting together a team of people around that child from multi-disciplines. So anybody who's a significant adult for that child, anybody who's got expertise and knowledge that it would be helpful to share, and who can commit to some actions to support that child in terms of avoiding an exclusion from school. So the approach involves 4 stages. So the first stage is the needs analysis. This is a little bit different to how we would often work, because often when we work, I think we're very quick to jump to the planning phase, maybe because we're short of time, maybe because we're just, I don't know, problem solvers. But as part of this approach, raising empathy and understanding is a really big aspect of what we're trying to do. And so we spend a whole hour and a half with the team sharing stories about the child, sharing information that we have around their family context, their school context, their background. We describe the different behaviours that are most likely to lead to exclusion, and we make links between the child's experiences and their behaviour until we come up with a list of needs. So that needs really is what needs is this behaviour communicating? What are the unmet needs? So what we're hoping to do in that meeting is shift people's understanding so that they're no longer describing a child's behaviour, they are describing a child's needs. And we often see that shift within the meeting. So the first time people talk about the child, you know, it's very much they don't pay attention, they're quite defiant, you know, they're very explosive in their behaviour. And then by the end of the meeting, those things are being very much described in terms of the needs that behaviour is communicating. So following that first meeting, the EdPsych then meets with the student to gain their understanding and their view of themselves. And the EdPsych will use a range of different techniques based on personal construct psychology. So that it's quite an in-depth meeting. It's more than just, you know, what do you think about how is school going? What might help you? We're really seeking to understand how the child sees themselves, how they see relationships and the availability of others, how they see school, you know, their internal working model really about themselves and the world around them. And then the Ed Psych becomes an advocate for the child in feeding those views back into the meeting. So sometimes that's done through showing pictures that the child's drawn or using the child's words. Sometimes the Ed Psych will write a letter with that child that is read out in the meeting. There are occasions when the child has gone to the meeting and read the letter out themselves, but in most circumstances it is the Ed Psych that becomes the sort of advocate for the child. And then we go into the third stage, which is the meeting where we're going to put the plan together. So what we do is we think back to the needs analysis, and it's interesting that there's usually a week between stage one and stage three. And it's interesting that the first question in that meeting is what's changed already. And often we find that having done that really in-depth needs analysis, there's already changes, because raising empathy and understanding means that people have already worked out what might be helpful. Yeah. So we think back to the needs analysis, we think about what we've learned from listening to the child, and we put together a plan. And then we identify any further support that might be needed. So often we're asked to share the plan with wider groups of staff, or we might be asked to do a little bit of training with the school in terms of developing their skills, for example, in using regulatory techniques or restorative approaches. And then 6 weeks later, we review the plan.
There's some themes that it won't be surprising for you guys here that often emerge out of those meetings. So each child's unique, each meeting is unique, each set of staff or adults that are contributing are unique. So they are different, but there's very common themes. So it won't be surprising for you to recognise that some of those themes in terms of underlying needs are something to do with a child's inability to regulate themselves and an inability to manage some of the difficulties that the academic and social world of school throws up for them. Another thing that emerges is difficulties within relationships, whether the children, you know, adaptive behaviours mean they seek to protect themselves by avoiding relationships, or they're indiscriminate with their forming of relationships. The idea that their kind of response to the challenge that comes from making yourselves vulnerable with relationships is that they will sabotage them or be rejecting, etc. Often there's stuff to do with the young person's identity and low concept of self and how that manifests itself in terms of their learning. And then another thing that emerges quite commonly, which people here might think sits under a kind of heading of executive functioning, you know, difficulties with some learning behaviours in terms of planning and attention and recall, etc. A very, very common theme, Catherine, if we think about our looked after children, is a lack of belonging and a sense of disconnection, and seeking to put plans in place that create more of a connection and more opportunities to be together feels important. And then finally, a common final theme is one of young people seeking control in order to feel safe, and therefore that manifesting itself through challenging behaviour in terms of defiance and being unable to accept direction, etc., from staff.
So REDS plans often involve something to do with communicating the child's needs to all the adults working with them, so that everybody has got a real shared understanding. Sometimes I think when we're working with really complex children, people think that the answers are going to be really complex as well. And what we found is often these REDS plans are very much to do with people just slightly changing the way that they are with the child. You know, when they start to see certain behaviours in class, rather than responding in a way that might be, I don't know, giving a warning or a harsh look or you know, or a reminder that they're going to have to do that work in their own time if they don't get on with it now. You know, rather than those kind of approaches that would be fairly standard in a classroom, you're going to use a slightly different approach. And so it might be about just thinking about what your face looks like, your tone of voice, developing scripts around dealing with things. So sometimes these things are they're very subtle to do with people's way of being. But what is really helpful is to have really clear plans, so everybody understands, when I see that behaviour, this is what it means, and when I see that behaviour, this is how I'm going to respond. I'm going to use these relational and regulation skills, and often an understanding of that in itself makes an enormous difference.
In fact, in the first workshop, Wendy was talking about a piece of work where a really complex situation around a young person in care, and the changes that are being made by staff, in some respects, are kind of like fundamental, you know, paradigm shifts, but they manifest themselves in really manageable, doable, simple, repeated things, like welcoming children into their class, like being warm and available, like showing empathy even when things are going wrong, like regulating yourself in an attempt to support the child to regulate. And in a way, this works. One of the most exciting things, but a potential challenge with this work, is it's quite simple stuff. That's really helpful in some respects, but also it's hard because when things feel a bit simple, then they can kind of fall off our radar because they're not as important as parents' evening and marking and sticking to time.
Yeah, and it can be hard because it's hard to be, you know, relational and use regulation skills if you yourself are feeling dysregulated because you might be stressed, or you might not understand what's going on, or you might have lots of other pressures. So I think one of the things that came out, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, is that teachers found this approach very supportive because it enabled them to work together more as a team.
Yes.
It gave them permission to be different. It gave them permission to support each other. You know, they could come back to us and talk to us about it. So it enabled really teachers, I think, to be very reflective about themselves and try different things in a really supportive way.
Yes, I think one of the challenges remains that, so the fourth bullet point here is about taking, some of the plans focus on adapting certain agreed responses. And I think that can be really hard because sometimes that's perceived as threat by the school systems. The school system says, no, if a child doesn't underline their title with a ruler, then they need to have massively punitive responses. And this suggests that it might not be that helpful to do that. So sometimes some of this work challenges some of the processes in place.
So plans often focus on having a significant adult for the child, and also developing connection not only to adults but to peers, because what we know is sense of belonging is hugely important, and we need to work out how we're going to develop the child's sense of belonging in school, because if they don't have it in school, they'll seek it elsewhere, and that will further disconnect them from school. And I think the last thing is, often in plans, we have a very clear outline of what's going to happen when things go wrong, and a real focus on using restorative approaches to mending relationships. And that's been hugely successful in terms of supporting inclusion.
And I think the final thing to say about empathy with that stuff is helping adults. And I know we've talked about this extensively before, Wendy, in terms of virtual school teamwork, but helping adults understand that repair is a feature of relationships. Success is not everything's rosy 24/7. And in fact, for our looked after children, it's probably the most significant learning that they could have. But when things go wrong, people will still stick around. That is like such significant experiential learning for kids who have experienced, when things go wrong, relationships rupture and are not repaired. I mean, I don't know, that's probably the most valuable work we can do for these kids.
So we've had a lot of success with this approach. So this year we had 21 referrals, which was a bit of a reduction from last year, I think because of COVID, because we were in lockdown.
And Wendy talked earlier on about, for some kids, that was really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's difficult to measure the success really of this work, but we do try to get the schools to give a score of their sort of risk of permanent exclusion at the start and their risk of permanent exclusion at the end. And when we started working with the children, the average was 8.4, and at the end it was 5.8. But what was really great about this year's work was that 6 weeks after, 100% of the students had the same school placement. So that immediate risk of permanent exclusion had died down. But an additional monitoring, 3 to 12 months later, indicated that 100% were still in the same placement. They were on roll at the same school. So it would be fair to say that some of those students were in alternative provisions, but were still on roll at the school. So the intention was to bring them back into that school. So I think we were very pleased with that data, and feedback from staff and carers was really positive. And so beyond supporting that child to stay in school, I think that the school and members of staff and also carers, there were wider benefits.
Hello, Wendy. We don't know if things emerged in the chat.
I'm just having a look. Pamela's also put in here, firstly, that she thinks it's brilliant, but it'd be useful to have this in the early years, linking in with TAF meetings to help parents understand their children's behaviour and needs. And there's no doubt, is there, that the earlier we can do this kind of work, the more successful, more chance of long-term success.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Something
So
that I have. Sorry,
we are starting to work a bit more with early year settings. So I don't know if you're aware that our attachment-based mentoring course, which we've been running for years now for schools, we've now written another version called Attachment-Based Beginnings, which is specifically for early year settings. I mean, so it's different from this, but it builds on exactly the same psychology and approaches. So there is Attachment-Based Beginnings now available for early year settings.
Yeah. Something that, and I haven't talked to Catherine and Matt about this, but with our virtual school remit growing to take in all children with social workers, it's something, although there's only so many of you guys to go around, that would be really beneficial is if we could extend some of this work for all children who are having suffered attachment and trauma, but are not yet in care and hopefully won't come into care. So that's on my agenda to be talking about, to see what we can do to extend it, because it is quite limited at the moment to the number of children that we can work with.
Yeah.
So that and I think even what I'm hoping is that we can at least offer training, free training, to all schools in Devon. And sorry folks if you're not in Devon, but I haven't got any money for you, but your own local authority will have some funding coming. Every local authority is having funding for virtual schools to work with that wider cohort. So you could be saying to them, great news that you're going to be working with all children with a social worker. What attachment and trauma training have you got that you can offer us?
Yeah.
Because I think that we have to start with those professionals that are working with the young people, understanding what the impact of those experiences are on the way in which they present, and how they find it really, really hard to be part of the natural school day. Quite often they do need some additional. I think we should couch all of this as well. We are well aware, and I've not that long been out of school, that schools are under massive pressure with reduced numbers of staff. So if you're here from a school thinking, well, that's all well and good, but do they not know that we don't have these massive pastoral teams that we used to have? We do get that, and it is really tough to have enough people to do often what you know is the right thing to do and you want to do, but you're getting, everybody's time is squeezed, isn't it? So
yeah, I think one of the things that makes me think about Wendy is reiterating something that Catherine said, that I think sometimes when situations feel really complex and children are coming with a great deal of a kind of potential kind of difficulties, it can lead us to feel like, what can I do about it? Do you know what I mean? It's like, this needs a psychologist, this needs CAMS, this needs therapy. And just to reiterate, it's really interesting that the conclusion from lots of the work in terms of ACEs, trauma, etc., is about relationships and is about relational experiences, is about small but very kind of conscious interactions between adults and children. And I think one of the most kind of hopeful messages of the work in terms of meeting those underlying needs is it doesn't feel like it needs really heavily resourcing. It feels like it needs to be at the forefront of everyone's mind, but doesn't necessarily need that person in school. When working relationally, we are A, not suggesting that adults become soft and permissive, and B, we're not suggesting that we don't necessarily have effective feedback to support thinking, which sometimes definitely looks like expressing gratitude and all of that sort of stuff. And arguably in the early stages of some of this relational stuff, Catherine, what could happen is whilst the reward is being administered, the token, the sticker, the additional time, a dojo, that there is also a brief interaction which supports a child in understanding the thing for which the token is representative, i.e. bloody dojos. Who's that in the chat? I am with them. Good work, right. So we know it's not the end of the world for children to experience kind of reward. It's just trying to make it meaningful, isn't it? And sometimes kids leave a school day with a sticker and the parent goes, look at you, you got a sticker. What'd you get the sticker for? And the kid goes, I got a sticker. And that is about as far as their understanding of that goes. Catherine, I'm really aware that
the same way sometimes for going to the reset room. So sometimes when you talk to, I used to say, why are you here? Well, because I got sent here.
Yeah.
Rather than because I threw a pair of scissors at a friend and it stuck in their back or something like that. You know, it wasn't, there was no explanation of why it was your name's gone on the board twice, but they didn't actually know why. No, many do, or most do, but sometimes it was more the action than the understanding.
Yeah, I like the idea of children becoming so skilled up that when somebody asks the question, why are you here, they can say, well, under threat, I respond with my amygdala, not my frontal cortex. And therefore, I really struggle to rationalize and process my thoughts at the time. But of course, I wasn't the only one dysregulated. The teacher at that moment, because of the trauma that schools are under. I love the idea of children developing really good narratives around why they might have been sent to reset and what they know is a better alternative for them. It's just that's probably the quickest way to get permanently excluded if you express it.
I think it might be, and you'd both be out of a job. So let's not get there too quickly.
I don't know.
I think I'm conscious, folks. I think we have to sign out of this one and then come back into the sort of final session for the day. And it gives you 4 minutes if anybody needs to pop to the loo or do whatever it is that you need to do. Pick the washing in because it's raining or whatever might be on your agenda. Big thank you, Catherine and Matt. Thank you so much. And I'm sure everybody can see why we hope these two lovely people continue to work with us, because they are doing an amazing job in helping our young people. Lisa, sorry, you've got your hand up.
Sorry.
Nice.
Sorry, I don't want to come in now if we're closing.
No, please do. We'd much rather talk to you than pick the washing in. That would be lovely.
I was just really interested when you talked about the approach and you talked about the plan. From your experience, is it a team who's owning that plan? Does the plan tend to look at the needs and what's happening within school? Does it look at the wider context for that young person?
It does tend to be around school because the sort of the immediate need is to avoid an exclusion. So it sort of starts being very school based, but when there are other professionals there, like social workers or to people from mental health, then they also take away actions to support what's happening in school. So we did one recently, didn't we, where there was a social worker who said that what she wanted to do, listening to the school talk, was to look at the timing of certain things that were happening for that child, because it felt like certain decisions were going to be made at exactly the wrong time in terms of success in school. So I suppose whilst it is very school based, other people definitely pick up actions to support what the school are trying to do.
That's great, Catherine, because very often what we see mirrored in school, it comes from complexities out in the community for young people, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, it does.
Absolutely, yeah.
From the police perspective, obviously our team's working a lot with the excluded cohort in Cornwall. And one of the feedback things that I get from them is that they very rarely have any inclusion within the team around the child stuff nowadays. And I don't know whether that's a pattern within Devon or if that's something which is maybe it's just an agency thing that we need to work on down here, or whether you've seen any difference in the take up there.
Yeah, I think there is a difference. So I'd say that 6 or 7 years ago, when we had team around the child meetings, we'd often have I'm going to get the acronym wrong now, PCSO, is that right? Yeah. And I think that And do they exist anymore?
We still have PCSOs, but we really, your team around the child stuff, we would normally expect our specialists to be in there. There's anything wrong with the PCSOs, I should say. It's just that the cohort that they concentrate on is obviously much more, the complex needs side would be where the specialists sit, and that's probably more appropriate for the team around the child type issues, really.
Yeah, but I do think that you're right. I think police involvement has tailed off, and I wonder, years ago, we used to have patches, and we used to have multi-agency meetings with all the people who were working with young people on those patches, and so I had a really strong relationship with the 2 PCSOs who were working in that area. But I think that way of working seems to become very fragmented, and I think it's possibly something to do with the demise of learning communities and now having academies and these big academy trusts, that we don't tend to work as well together anymore as learning communities. So I think, I don't know whether there are less police available. It feels like that in Devon. It feels like we don't have those connections anymore with those. Well, I don't think that there are any PCSOs anymore.
Yeah, they're still there. They're still there.
In Devon as well, are they?
Yeah, oh yeah. What I'm wondering is and what I'm coming around to in a long-winded way is that we've within our child-centered policing and our vulnerability strategies, which are now they're being published now, really. But there's probably activities that we should be looking at in terms of regenerating that sort of intervention, where we're involved, I guess. Really, it's probably something I can take forward.
Yeah.
So Sandra asked a question about, just maybe a statement, we use early help, multi-professional, and involves tax and TAFs.
Yeah.
Yes, so we do use early help, but the uptake is really poor. I think the problem with our company, so I'm from Together Drug and Alcohol Service, so I'm one of the family leads, is that we've just got so many staff coming and going, and to get them to understand the RAFA system, that's like referring someone into early help and like updated notes. It's a very complicated and long-winded process, and I think a lot of professionals are just put off by the process. I think if we could go back to the old days where it was a lot simpler, I think you'd get more professionals engaging in the TAFs and the tax.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you, Sandra.
You're welcome.
I think something that maybe wasn't portrayed enough is the success of the project. That we feel that it has prevented an awful lot of children from being permanently excluded. And obviously that's the aim of it, but it's also about changing the culture of a school as well and the way of thinking. Yeah. So it has a sort of double-edged sword, really, that yes, it's good for that particular young person at that time. And we did have a particular school who were adamant about a young person, and that was it, and they couldn't come back, and they had done some pretty naughty, outrageous things. And actually the school bought into that multi-agency meeting around the child in a way I didn't expect them to. And that child has now seen year 11 out, still with lots of ups and downs and moments, but it actually did in the end boil down to a couple, one in particular, really key members of staff who saw that this young person would only go in one direction if they left the school, and was determined to work with her and be, oh my goodness, relentlessly accepting and talking through, oh dear, that was a bit of a mess up, wasn't it? Well, how are we going to get that to not happen next time? And also take the staff with them. So it's about having the right people in the right jobs, as well as changing the mindset of the leadership in the school as well. So that was a really successful outcome for everybody, and the school are really on board with the whole thing, and they're just going to start doing the relational work now, or I can't remember if they're doing Timpson, I think, aren't they?
Yes, they are. Yeah.
But you're right; they've become further interested in this sort of work, and I think, Wendy, it's a good point that you make, that although the primary concern is about supporting the inclusion of that child. What we are always hopeful happens is the development in empathy and understanding is something that those adults can carry around with them throughout their work and throughout their way of being, so that there's a kind of shift in terms of how they think about behaviour and the presentation that behaviour is of underlying needs, so that it doesn't become reserved for 1 or 2 children. It becomes more about how a school thinks about things, and that's ultimately, I guess, our hope, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's a comment just popped in which I wouldn't want to ignore.
Thank you, Glenda. That's good. I think we feel like we are continuing to try very hard to do this stuff. Although really interestingly, in Devon, last year the project of developing relational practice and policy, of that document that I put in the chat at the start, we imagined that we would be working with maybe half a dozen schools at most that would show an interest, and we had around 24 or something. So we think that there is a strong drive in schools for wishing to work more in this way. But I guess we recognise when everything feels quite difficult and stressful and slightly traumatizing for all adults in school, we all tend to refer to our default and we go behaviorism. But yes, we're working on it, Glenda. We'll continue to work hard.
I think Lisa just popped something in about whether we're working with school mental health teams. I think if they're in schools, we would, wouldn't we?
Yeah, absolutely. If they're involved with a child who's been referred, or if the DT or Sanko in the school thinks that they should be involved, then they would be invited to the REDS meeting.
I suppose I was thinking, because these new mental health in schools teams are very much also about changing culture.
Yeah,
and it's more that than direct work with children and young people. And I'm in core cams more, so I'm not very involved with that. So I just wondered how, or if, you know, your two approaches are compatible. It's probably a bigger conversation than for now. I'm aware we need to stop, but I just wanted to raise it because I'm really interested. I think the REDS process is fantastic.
I can't help but feel that they would be super compatible in terms of like recognizing underlying needs and trying to meet those needs through a really joined up approach. And that document, keep banging on about it, don't I? That document, Lisa, that's in the chat at the start, or a link to the document and stuff, that's freely available to everyone across, you know, it's not just for Devon, it's throughout, although it was developed within Devon. So if people were interested, that link in the chat is a good place to start in terms of sharing that document if you think people would be interested.